So you decided to start a podcast, you came up with your minimum plan to launching your podcast, and you clearly defined your whys for your podcast. And now it's time to think about your episode flow and how's the format going to be. My suggestion is to start off simple. So don't overthink it. Don't think too hard about it. If you're new to podcasting or new to putting your voice out there, just do something really simple. And the simplest thing, in my opinion, is to come up with a questionnaire. And that way you can have the questionnaire in front of you while you're doing the interview. If you lose your train of thought, you can always just look back at the questionnaire, see what question you're on, or look at the next question and keep the conversation going. You don't have to have good interview style and interview capabilities right off the bat. You'll get that with iterations and practice. But you don't let that stop you from starting. So the important thing is to have a questionnaire that you can follow. If you ask a question, the guest answers it, and you want to dive deeper into it, dive deeper into it. But if you're not ready to do that, your interview skills aren't there yet, then just ask a question, get the answer, ask a question, get the answer, ask a question, get the answer, and just start off like that. It's very simple. You may not be as proud about it, but you can get going, get started, and it's going to get you to launch your podcast much quicker, and you'll evolve over time. I promise you. Some considerations for you to think about when creating your list of questions to start is to have open-ended questions. You don't want the question to have a yes or no answer. You want the question to spark conversation and get the guests talking. Try to get some eyes to look at it before you actually use it. That way you have a little bit of momentum going behind it with some iterations. If you ask several people and you got feedback, or you don't have anyone in your community you can ask feedback to, then I've had several people send me their questionnaires. And if it's just a list of questions and it's very easy and quick to look at, I don't mind looking at that. So you can go to my website, shoot me an email with your questionnaire, and I'd be happy to give you some feedback on that. In the previous video, you clearly defined the why for yourself, for the guest, for the listener, and the opportunities that you want to rise. So I would base your questions on all of those whys. So maybe take a piece of paper or open a Word doc and start dumping a bunch of questions that you want to dive into related to the whys that you created and related to the topic of your podcast. Now I've done roughly 50 interviews, and I don't have to necessarily look at my questionnaire, but it is nice to have the talking points in front of me sometimes if I lose my train of thought, or if the conversation diverges and goes down a slippery slope in some direction. I can always bring it back to the path that I want. And sometimes being on the spot, especially since now I'm doing live stream interviews, I don't want to have to be hiccuping as much. So I have the talking points in front of me. I'm not going to go into too much detail with my episode flow, but I do want to showcase it in case you get any inspiration, or if you can repurpose some of it for your content based on your why or the topic of your podcast. I always like to introduce the guest. So I'll do the research before the interview, and then I'll introduce the guest, and then I'll open the floor for the guest to introduce themselves in case there's something I missed, or something that is new that they're focusing on, or something that I missed during my research. After that, I dive into the core part of the interview, where I start with the why. So I deep dive into why the person started. Why did you start your podcast, or why did you start your Instagram account, or speaking on stage, or writing your book? So I really deep dive into that. So I don't just ask, why'd you start, get the answer, and move on. For me, it's important to dive deep there. So I keep going multiple layers deep. Why is that important to you? And just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper until we find core values that go into their why that makes them so unstoppable that they're able to overcome any barrier that gets in their way because their purpose is driving them. Then we go into overcoming barriers. How did you overcome the barriers that were in your way when you were starting? Or could you have started earlier, but there were barriers in the way that was stopping you? What were those barriers? How did you overcome them? Then we go into unintended consequences, where I ask the guests to share some stories about people they've impacted. And it's not uncommon where I hear stories from guests talking about how they've literally saved people's lives as a result of their sharing. It could be as simple as creating car review videos, and then those car review videos are giving a father and son bonding time because it's a tradition for them to watch that video together. And then you get to hear that story from a listener, and that's like the unintended consequence. That person didn't start creating car review videos to bring a father and son's relationship closer together. There's so many unintended consequences that come from sharing that I love to extract those stories because it helps with inspiration for for a lot of people to start sharing. Then I talk about income. So, how are you making money? A lot of people are influencers in different ways. You have different income streams. Maybe you're getting affiliate income. Maybe you're getting income through ads. Maybe you have an online store or a course. Where's your money coming from as an influencer? And I dive into that with a guest as deep as they're willing to go. And then we talk about tips and tricks. So what kind of advice, tips or tricks do you have for new influencers in your space? So if you're a podcaster, what are some of the biggest tips and tricks you have for new podcasters or for new YouTubers or new public speakers? Then I dive into advice for experienced people. So if you have a YouTube channel and you've had massive growth with your YouTube channel, what's some of the secret sauce that you've used to grow your YouTube audience? And then I sort of close up the episode. I ask for some final words and I offer the floor for the guests to talk about their brands. I help make them look good at the end. And then at the very end, I like to ask for feedback because I'm still on my journey, still trying to grow. So I try to ask for feedback from the guest on how the whole process was. Do they have any advice? Was it a good experience overall? What kind of advice do you have for me? That's the episode flow for my podcast, the Why Influence podcast. Every podcast is going to be different. It's based on the topic. It's based on the whys. It's based on the guests that you have, the listeners that you want, the opportunities you want to open up. So make sure you sit down, put some time into coming up with the questionnaire, the format. What are you going to talk about with the guests? What questions do you want to ask? What value you want to extract? And put all that down on a piece of paper and create a literal questionnaire, word for word, question for question, and get that down so that you can use that to show to other people, get some feedback, and then maybe even use it for the first couple interviews so that you don't lose your train of thought. You know where you're asking. Don't be afraid to dive deeper after the question. So if you ask a question, don't feel like you have to go to the next question. Nobody's sitting there telling you have to do something. So you can always go off track and dive deeper into something. But it may take some practice to do that. So if you're uncomfortable, just create a questionnaire and literally just ask the question, get the answer, ask the question, get the answer. And that's still a podcast. So just get started. That's the main thing. And then over time, you'll get better. After you get the podcast flow down, the next step is to come up with a podcast title, the description, the artwork, some of those components of the podcast. So we'll be talking about that in the next video. Again, a lot of podcasts are creating courses on how to create a podcast, and I'm putting this together for free. All I ask for is some engagement. So if you like this video, you got some value, just hit the like button and leave a comment in the description. Maybe subscribe to the YouTube channel or check out the podcast. But just engage with me. That's all I ask for. And I look forward to seeing you in the next episode where we'll be talking about the podcast title, the description, the artwork, and things like that. All right, thanks for watching.